my pleasure now to start to meet some of the people attending the conference. Can you tell us your name and your job and what brought you here?
My name's Gwen Cherney, and I'm with the Australian Civil Military Centre. I've been working on a project for peace and stabilisation operations with the Australian government for the last 2 years.
So my name's Gary Stone, and I'm a married deacon in the Catholic Church, and I've had a range of involvements over the years with Defence, with the Australian Federal Police, and running a humanitarian organisation. And I've come along here to encourage people to see that the churches and church agencies can play a significant role in all sorts of humanitarian operations and peace building and peacemaking.
Yes, I'm Brigadier Dickie Haldenby. I'm Deputy Director of Joint Warfare in the Joint Forces Command in the UK. I've come here because I take the lead for operational level lessons and defence level lessons in the UK.
My name is Mike Kelly. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary for Defence, and under my wing, of course, is the Australian Civil Military Centre that is helping to organise this conference, and I also have responsibility for Afghanistan transition within the defence portfolio in assisting the Minister in that regard, as well as in our UN peace operations area.
And your own background that's pertinent to this conference?
Well, I spent 20 years in the Army before going into politics, and my career was really immersed in issues of counterinsurgency, stabilisation operations and peacekeeping, and how to really deal with the challenges of the very complex multidimensional operational environments we've been finding ourselves in these last few decades.
Yes, I'm Jules Frost, and I am working with World Vision International. I'm the Senior Advisor for Civil Military Affairs for the International Partnership of World Vision.
The theme of this conference is transitions. What is a transition? Why is it so important?
I think that's debatable, and that's probably part of the issue at this point in time, is there are many definitions of transition. Are you talking transition from military being there to just the civilian agencies remaining there, or are you talking about transitioning from an operation to the host nation being in charge completely, or from just the normal state that our DFAT would work in, or the Department of State would be there in that country for a long period of time? Development agencies are in many of these countries for long periods of time. Is it just when the military leaves, or is it saying something else? And I think that's up for debate at this particular moment.
Sure. Well, I think that the transitions really are about local people taking responsibility for their futures, and us being able to respect that and see how we can facilitate that in an appropriate way.
Well, we're about to see a huge transition in the Afghanistan theatre. Perhaps the thing that makes it distinct is that when you have an operation that's been running for a long time, an enduring operation, a lot of the risk gets taken out over time. You start to reintroduce that risk and uncertainty when you change from one environment to another, and that's why it's so important, because the risk of failure increases at that point.
Well, transitions are perhaps one of the most complicated things. It's when you've invested an immense amount of resources in bringing about stability, perhaps. Perhaps it's bringing peace to a community. And now whatever international presence has been assisting in that is going to shift their focus. And the nation state or the community itself is going to be working more on their own. And that is such a tenuous, fragile time period where everyone is shifting. And when there's change, that can be tumultuous. So how do you do that in the most seamless, most effective way where you can keep the gains that have been made and continue to move forward?
At the end of the day, what we're all aiming to achieve in these environments is our own redundancy. And that is a clear message that has to be absorbed right from the start. So you don't want to build dependency, you want to build local capacity and look for every opportunity you can to enhance that and promote that.
If after we leave a place like Afghanistan, if things go belly up and conflict re-emerges, does that mean the mission has failed, our contribution has failed? Is the measure as tough as that?
Well, certainly in terms of national objectives that Australia had in Afghanistan, we wanted to deny an entire country being at the disposal of terrorist movements in our region and beyond. And if that is achieved, then we will have gone forward regardless. But longer term, we do have another objective, which is to ensure regional stability by having at least a situation in Afghanistan that is on a positive track.
I don't think we would go as far as to say the investments have been completely wasted, because during this time period, children have been saved, children have been educated, communities and families have survived, and they've been equipped. So now they can make some choices. And that's the key, is how during a transition do you empower these communities to continue to move forward?
All you can possibly do is try your very best, and if something goes really wrong or you have a disaster or catastrophe, you'll have done your best. But that sort of accepting the situation doesn't mean you don't have to try your best to avoid a disaster in the first place, or a setback in the first place.
The biggest challenge you face in learning lessons?
I'd say institutionalizing those lessons, absolutely hands down the hardest problem.
What does that mean?
Getting those lessons from paper, from conversations, into actual action, and making it into something that we can actually see that change, and those lessons that have been learned. So, something happened in Ramsey, and now we're looking to future operations, future disasters, and have we actually learned those lessons? Are there now structures, processes in place that stop us from making those same mistakes?
Why is it so hard in relation to humanitarian aid and conflict situations to learn lessons?
Well, I don't think it actually relates to the nature of the operations. I think it more relates to the nature of how police and militaries work. So for myself in the church, we have a long-term approach, like thousands of years type approach, whereas for my 43 years in the military, I've had to change jobs every 1 or 2 years into completely diverse and different situations, and so there's very little corporate knowledge kept on any particular topic. And people, we tend to breed generalists and not really have any specialists.
I suspect because in terms of humanitarian aid and those sorts of operations that you're normally talking about a very long period of time, and it's very difficult to track change, it's very difficult to affect change, and there are many different players, so it's not just a military thing, it's military, political, economic, and there are so many interplays that sometimes it's very difficult to identify, what the actual problem really is.
Well, we have a lot of impediments in our own backyards to doing things effectively, because our agencies and organisations often have different subcultures and find it hard to relate to each other often, and certainly that complicates things in the field. But also organisationally, working across agencies to come up with sound strategies at a very high level is a problem. But certainly I found that the varying cultural contexts need to be deeply understood as well. Getting a group like this together is wonderful, because the most important thing you can have to enhance our ability to do these things better is a broad range of experience and perspectives, particularly in finding the things that will work in a cultural context.
A successful example of lessons learned?
Absolutely. Creating the national security architecture in Australia, that was a lesson learned.
What is that?
It's the way the Australian government comes together to respond to any conflict, crises, etc. And that is the mechanism with which they make decisions, they make policy, and then they see those in action.
I can't think of a specific example now. What I can say is something that's working really well for us right now, which is embedding our lessons practitioners in the operational planning process from the start. So rather than picking a plan to pieces after the event or even after the operation's finished, we're considering what mistakes we made, but things that have gone well as well, right from the start.
Well, I think there's been quite a number of them actually, going through Somalia and all of our missions. We've drawn a lot about the need to address public security and have certain capacities and to develop the governing capacity of places. So the lessons we learned in Somalia, we took forward to Timor and developed internationally the capacity to have more civil policing capabilities in terms of training and sometimes performing executive functions as well. So that capacity has grown over the years, but certainly also the way in which we get involved in development that doesn't create dependencies, and in those post-conflict situations, that's very important. So I think gradually we are building accountability mechanisms and successful criteria for moving those issues forward.
That's a very good question, and one doesn't immediately come to mind. However, I'm learning more about this second transition, perhaps, that will take place in East Timor. And I think that community, that country, is now in a position where it's equipped to move forward in a better way than it was when the international community tried to transition perhaps too early. Another one maybe, although it's different, is Aceh in Indonesia, and how we had such a long period of war. You had a natural disaster take place. You had a huge influx of international players, which there hadn't been. And that was an opportunity that was seized by the local community, the leaders, and they made a transition. Now the question is, how long is that going to hold? What's the health of that transition? What's the strength of that? But I think that's a positive one we can look to.
What's a question that you'd like to hear discussed at this conference, because it's important for your work?
For my work specifically, I think we're talking about learning lessons, and I think that is for everyone here. So really, how do we learn lessons? Do we institutionalize them? How do we get past the politics of them? And how do we actually get realistic responses instead of these very ideal ideas of how we can learn lessons?
For myself, I suppose it's how we encourage people to develop a more than whole of government, like a whole interagency approach to operations overseas, and absolutely to respect the needs and desires of the local people to work out solutions that are going to be sustainable in the long term for them.
I would like to know how people manage to get senior commanders, very senior commanders, to accept the recommendations of people from lessons organisations. Most of the militaries I've come across have a culture of the commander's assessment, and when the staff's advice differs from that assessment, sometimes they're not willing to listen. As juniors, we have a saying where we should speak truth under power. I think commanders should have a culture of listening to the truth that comes from their subordinates sometimes.
I guess one of the big questions would be is how do we make that decision of when we used armed cover together as a community, where it's not the military's decision themselves, it's not the humanitarian community's decision in isolation of the awareness of what the military is doing, and that we also work with the nation state and the community to make that decision.
I just want to close by asking you about the Australian Civil Military Centre hosting this conference. I think you created it. What's its fundamental purpose? Why are you proud of this contribution to public life?
Well, it was a key reason why I agreed to enter politics in the first place, because it greatly enhances our approach to security internationally and regionally, mainly because it performs a fantastic outreach mechanism to engage in discussions like this internationally, but more importantly to refine our own approach, to break down those subcultural barriers and stovepipes that prevent us from defining holistic end states and finding ways to plan forward across the agencies to achieve that holistic end state.
And why is it important to have this conference here in Australia? Because it's been all over the world.
It is a great coup for us. It's a great honour for us, the first time in the Southern Hemisphere, let alone Australia. And certainly I think it's a tribute to our growing influence in the world, as also evidenced by our victory in securing the seat on the Security Council. And so being able to be part of these events will also inform and support our effort now in these next 2 years to take our messages and our perspectives to the world as well on how to do things better in respect to the challenges that this conference is dealing with.
Thank you very much.
No worries, Julie. Cheers.
Thank you.